All right, we should be live. We are back, and I do apologise about that. For those of you that are watching this for the second time, we've had some issues today with my internet, and it's been dropping in and out all day. And I was about to go up and go to bed, and I just realised what it was, and I was mucking around with my VPN before, and that's thrown out the whole network. Anyway, I won't go into the details, but we are back. I think I know what the problem was. We shouldn't drop out again. Oh, never a dull day. Never a dull day, is there? So, guys, I will just give everyone a second to tune in because we had, I think, over 300 watching. And then we will get into it. But appreciate you guys coming back. And hopefully, a lot of people are sitting there waiting for the right stream to come on live. And I've got a feeling it's going to be a different... it will be, won't it? It'll be a different link. Take two. No VPN dropping out. And I'll just drop that in the group again for our members. Sorry, guys. Never a dull day in crypto or macro markets these days. Everyone's joking about the YouTube taking down my video. No, we can't blame YouTube this time, guys. It was actually my fault. Okie dokie. And it looks like you've all jumped back on. So very, very smart cookies. I don't have to tell you guys what to do. You know the drill when these things happen. Done, and done. Okay, it's not going to be a long one tonight. We're going to whip through it all. So, without further ado, 300 are back. You're all back. I love it. Let's take two. Smash that like button. Let's see if we can't get that up to 1,000 likes before the end of this video. And this is going to be packed full of juicy alpha, as they say. All right. Okay. So, a little while ago, 2 years ago now, we started working on our documentary, and it was one of the most watched videos we've ever done until Raul came and blew it out of the water with that great chat. But in this video, we spoke a lot about the options that different central banks have. Funny enough, this part jumps up. These are the huge exposure of Aussie banks and the mortgages on their books. And sure enough, we had Bank of Queensland basically tell their shareholders the other day, prepare for losses, and they've got huge exposure. And for the beginners that are saying, how can it be over 100%? Well, because of that fractional reserve nature, where banks can lend you $1 million and you've only got to put down that deposit of 100,000, for example. So that's how they get up towards these huge market caps and exposures. But you don't want every mortgage to be that leveraged up. But that's the current position of our banks and their mortgage books and our housing market. So this is all going to tie together with what's going on. If you haven't watched that doco, or even if you have and you haven't watched it since, it's coming up on 2 years. Go back and rewatch it. And this is just unfolding play by play with what we're worried about in terms of government debt. This is the first thing I want to talk about tonight was, these two, the regulators, the government, the central bankers not getting on. Okay, and they were both going to play the blame game because they were both, I guess, running out of tools on who can do what. And they were going to try and do more stimulus. And I predicted that we'd see, reintroduction and bigger first home owner grants and builder grants. We've got that. The 5% down scheme, something that's crazy. If you can't even afford 10%, how are you going to pay off a house? 95% of the rest of that loan. And we posed the question about, is the RBA going to be next? Because they have no choice. And at the time, our central bank was saying we're never going to go down that path of QE. It's just so unlikely. It's not worth talking about. Negative interest rates will go to zero. We don't even worry about that. Things are good. And at the time, he was still talking about raising interest rates like everything was rosy. So you can go back and Google these and just look at some of the tweets and some of the news articles about how Philip Lowe, pretty quiet guy, but he started to hint that the RBA are kind of running out of tools, or I guess global central banks in general. He was one of the only central bankers that was honest and saying that negative interest rates hasn't actually worked that well in Europe. We're starting to see that there's evidence that it's actually bad and it strains the banks. So you look back at all these articles and he started to get more and more of a sense of urgency in what he was saying when we started to see the housing market downturn, saying things like, you need to be doing more, but the government are here thinking, we're doing a fair bit by historical standards, and our government had that surplus in their sights. So they always thought that they were, just doing a fantastic job. When if you look at the actual numbers, it was things like immigration, 200, 300, 400,000 people a year. And you bring in all those people and it can kind of mask what's really going on. So it's just so interesting. And if you've been a subscriber to the channel over this time, I'm sure you're thinking exactly what I'm thinking, where Philip Lowe, Frydenberg, they're split on the stimulus. One saying that you need to do more, the other saying that you need to do more. And it just became more and more vocal and more public, as opposed to two people that would never have ever gone at each other, and particularly in the public eye or in the media. So that is just one example of that relationship. But obviously the big one was Donald Trump. As soon as he got elected, he was tweeting at the Fed, and he has taken Twitter and social media to the next level. Today, he had a huge tweet storm, which we'll get to in just a sec. But basically what he started saying was, other countries have got zero or negative interest rates. We want those in the US. Why is Germany getting paid to borrow money? And yet we can't in America. So that's the kind of thing he started saying. Just go back and look through these tweets. Back in 2018, very strong dollar, no inflation. Look at the outside world blowing up around us. Just time and time again, blaming the Fed, or just saying, hey guys, cut rates and start printing money and do what the rest of the world's doing. And then it got more and more, I guess, aggressive, saying Powell shouldn't even be chairman. His job's in question. The Fed are hopeless. They're doing nothing. He's kind of patting himself on the back with how great the stock market's going. Now, to some degree, I do think that what Trump did has taken the stock market higher. Huge tax cuts for businesses and all that. If you make them pay less tax, guess what? They're going to make more money, and everyone wants to own businesses that make more money, and shareholders have been absolutely smothered and hosed in dividends, and then they get to borrow more money and buy back those shares. So look, everything has sort of worked in their favor to really make these overheated conditions. And at the time, because of everything else that was in play, the Fed and all central banks just can't get that little inflation that they want, that nice 2 or 3% growth in the way that they measure the economy and CPI and those other measures. So they're constantly thinking, we have to cut rates or print money and do those things that we've always done. But what I'm going to get to tonight, that's just the most important thing ever to understand in terms of what is happening around us, is that those rules and those levers and those things have basically stopped working. And this is something that we've been saying in one way or another. Professor Steve Keen, alternate economists, rogue people in finance that have spoken out against the mainstream narrative, and universities, the courses that are taught. It's a little bit like medicine and pharmacy and all those things that you run into and butt heads up against. And it's just frustrating to say that, no, what you're teaching and everything you know is kind of wrong. And that's where it's got to now. And we're starting to see for the first time the big dogs actually admit this, or not admit it, but kind of hint at it and start to create a narrative or justify that, no, they're not wrong, but. And that's where the conversation is going. So last night, Powell, if you go back and watch some of these talks and these words and other governors, they're all but saying that monetary policy is kind of a blunt tool. It's not really working. they're not really keen on going negative. They've already purchasing 120 billion a day in bonds and other securities, which is more than what they were doing at the height of QE3. So they've basically got nothing left. Now, of course, they're saying that there's plenty more they can do. They have to say that and pretend they're in control. But this is on the same day as the stimulus talks broke down. And sure enough, every time the market's had this correction, it's been almost like they're holding the central bankers and government hostage, and it's this big standoff, this game of chicken. And remember, I think in past years, let's go over and have a look at the market. If you're a subscriber on the channel, you remember back in November 2018 and a few of these corrections when a lot of people go down the rabbit hole for the first time and they think, this is the big crash, this is the mother of all crash, and silver's going to go to $600 now and gold to 5,000, Bitcoin to 100,000, and I'm going to be rich, because they've just got into investing. And I made that mistake back in these early years as well. Every sort of correction after the big GFC, everyone, all the fearmongers were saying, crash is coming, and they've been able to buy themselves time because that printed money has basically gone directly into all these assets. And so even this crash here, we saw how bad the situation was and the fear, and look, even that has been able to have this aggressive rebound where the Fed pledged a lot, but as we saw, they didn't actually even end up buying that many junk bonds or those types of things, but they gave the market confidence they were going to if they needed to, and they flooded the liquidity there. And as we know, once the central banks are happy with all the extra dry powder they've got for lending purposes, then any extra money they had can now be used to speculate. So where we find ourselves now is in this, again, a correction where I think the markets were really holding them to account again and holding them hostage and thinking, as soon as we have this correction and there's a bit more fear, or there's another round of COVID or whatever it is, central bankers are going to step in. They've got our back. They always do. There's going to be another couple of trillion passed. There's no way that they're going to let these markets correct. And the nastiest one that we actually got was here when Powell, he was only fairly new at the time, and he kind of stood up to the market and he said, we're on a set course. We're raising rates all throughout next year, which was 2019. We're rolling off our balance sheet. So rather than buying bonds and mortgage-backed securities and that and raising the balance sheet, we're actually unwinding it. So we're selling all that into a market. And when the markets had been correcting, and then he came out and said that markets really, really panicked. And they thought, you can't be serious. We thought you had our back. And we're speculating. And this is almost showing like as soon as the real metrics that are in play, a free market is allowed to go through price discovery, the true liquidity, the algos. As soon as there's any sort of real market, look how quickly things sort of snap back and roll over. And that shows you how much it's being propped up by their actions directly or indirectly. And that's where very famously around Christmas Day, I think it was, when Powell came out and did that big backflip and said, you know what, we're not on a set course. We're not going to keep raising rates. Actually, we're going to start cutting them again. And once again, markets charged higher. So that's where we're at the moment. And the question really becomes, are they going to backflip again? Or is this time kind of different because they can't backflip? He can't say, you know what, I'm going to cut, over the next few months, we're going to cut 4 or 5%, and then we're going to be at negative 4 or 5%. They can't do that. And we see with the election coming up, their hands are tied as well. So this is, I guess, the really bearish scenario. If nothing happens, stocks could get hit really hard. We've got to wait and see if money actually flows to the dollar, or again, this is another first time ever. Are things different this time where it's the dollar that's people don't want to be in? So do they go to gold or whatever else? But just a couple more charts I want to show you quickly here. So this is Australia. This is our government budget. And we have had a lot more years in surplus compared to other countries because of the huge boom in China. And our government was obsessed with getting it back there. They almost got it back there. And this is one of those reasons why they haven't been thinking, you know what, we do need to go really hard on science, education overhauls, modernising our economy. And actually, central bankers in some of these podcasts they've been doing have even spoken about how they deliberately used almost housing to create the next bout of inflation, and they can't really do that again. You know, house prices can't grow 7%, 10% a year for the next 10 years because wages just aren't growing. So, yeah, that wasn't too bad in terms of our government's running huge deficits. Now, the recent budget is enormous. They're talking about being at $1 trillion debt in Australia within 2 years. But this is the government debt to GDP, where this was very low compared to a lot of other countries still as well. So when Philip Lowe is saying you guys need to do more, and the government think, you know, we're doing so much better than every other country. What's he talking about? But he's kind of looking at it and looking at those things that I'm talking about, where he can see what is coming, that things aren't that great, and you've got a huge propensity to actually spend more because of that situation you're in compared to a lot of other places. So yeah, this government debt in Australia is about to go parabolic, currently at around 500 billion. Over the next few years, I think, was it 2024, maybe even sooner. Anyway, that looks like it's going to be over $1 trillion in Australia within the next few years. In America, we know that's already sort of on that parabolic part of the curve where it's jumped to 27 this year. Their debt to GDP ratio, or let's just have a look at the Fed's balance sheet first. This is what they're scared about because they don't want to do it. They don't want to have to step in and be the last buyer of another 3 trillion worth of bonds, because if they're the only person that's willing to buy the bonds, the currency can start to get hit and confidence is lost from overseas investors. The same thing could happen in Australia as well. At the moment, the Aussie dollar's been held up very well because we haven't shown any intent to print a lot of money, to cut rates, to go negative like other countries have. So another prediction that we spoke about, where the RBA in Australia would be forced to do all this crazy easy money. So this shows you the rock and the hard place of why other countries don't want to do it. Why governments don't want to go into more debt, because in a lot of countries like America, they are already drowning in debt and it's never going to be paid back. In Australia, we've probably got a little bit more scope to do that, but our government wanted the surplus. So we had a different reason why we're behind the 8 ball now, and it's very hard to get back in front of things. Now, this is Japan, and they went through all of this after their tech boom in the 90s. Real estate boom, their markets boom, tech-led economy, and everyone thought, wow, Japan just so futuristic. And now they've gone through all these challenges that the Western countries are facing, aging demographics. They had that huge debt, and this is their debt to GDP ratio. So they got to 100, and that's kind of when things were, I guess, where do we go from here? The same situation that most Western countries are currently in now. And they just kept printing money, kept rates low or negative. The Japanese central bank ended up buying basically every bond, and then started buying mortgage-backed securities, commercial mortgage-backed securities, corporate debt, ETFs, stocks, and it's almost like everything you print, everything you create, anything that has been created through debt, like issuing these corporate bonds or whatever it is, a big mortgage that you've borrowed, they're monetizing that. They're the one that's buying things and bailing it out and getting that money into the system, and it's just caused the debt to go up massively, and they've just been in this stagflation where nothing really happens and they just can't get growth. And that's what all these other countries and central bankers are very aware, that they are staring on the cliff, and they're staring at this. Steve Keen and I love Steve. He was one of the people that called the 2008 financial crisis. We've been talking about this in every interview we've done over the past few years, and clueless central banks and turning Japanese. And he jokes about how they've got a map of Venus and they're on Mars. And that is, I actually think that we are starting to see it. So yes, the Nikkei boomed and topped back in the 90s there. That's a pretty healthy run from 8,000 to 40,000. If we take into account inflation, it's probably still got a long way to go to get back to break even if you bought the top. But this is just another sign that these things can happen in the most technically advanced, what everyone thought were the best economies in the world. It can happen, and they're one of the most important currencies in the world. It's not like they're a tiny country that underwent hyperinflation either. So in Australia, our stock market chart actually looks scarily familiar, where we had this huge peak and it took over a decade to get back to new highs, 12 years, and we just sort of popped our head above there, grabbed the liquidity, and then we rolled out of bed and had a bit of a bounce now back up into this triangle. But look, I really think if we don't get a heap of easy money can push stocks up, aggressive negative interest rates, things that force people into stocks. But if we don't go down that path and things are left to run their course, then I'm not sure that stocks are going to be a good place to be. But I will cover that week to week because we know how quickly that can all change. But now let's get to the current news over the past 48 hours. So what we've seen is Trump and Powell going into this week. You need to do more. You need to do more. Trying to negotiate with the opposition to get this package through. I think one wants $1.5 trillion, the other wants $2.5, and they just can't agree. It's like watching your parents get divorced, unfortunately, and I've been that, and it's just like meet in the middle. You're just wasting everyone's time and money, and there's real people that are being affected by this. Millions of people in this case that are being affected by this every day that you just can't agree to because of politics. And that can stay the case after the election, depends on who's in charge of each house and all that stuff. It's the same in Australia. We just get these even splits and nothing really ever happens. So who knows how long that is going to drag on and end in homelessness and mental health issues and all that. But once again, Powell is now making it very, very clear. It's almost like these guys are going on record because they don't want to be in these interviews on 60 Minutes on a Sunday night saying, why didn't you see this coming again after the last financial crisis? So a lot of the very rich billionaires and legendary investors are saying things like, buy gold, the US dollar, all fiat currencies, you don't want to be there, tech stocks are overvalued. And now Fed chairman coming out and saying there's a huge risk of a downward economic spiral. And not even the old, she'll be right, it'll get better next year. In Australia, they're saying, 2024, 4 years away until we might get back to where we were in terms of employment. So if you've lost your job, sort of good luck over the next 4 years. If you happen to be one of those people that does get a job, these are really, really scary things that are being said by the people that normally talk everything up and it's always going to be fine. So I do agree with the glacial speed that the Aussie Central Bank, for example, they did nothing and now they've got to wait another month. But in a month, unemployment can have ticked up 1%. We can start to see default rates go. Our government hands down the budget and they say things like, we're going to create this many jobs over this many years and 4 years' time, we'll get back to where we were. Why wouldn't you go out as hard as you possibly can and say, we're going to create too many jobs. We want to be so competitive that there's an abundance of high-paying jobs because we've become global leaders in ABC, research, renewables, science, technology, sport, health, whatever it is. I don't care. But once again, in the packages, it's I like to see the tax cuts and getting money in the pockets of those people that do need them, the middle class, the lower class. But it's the top end of town that still doesn't really pay that much tax. Effectively, a lot of them pay none. But it's these incentives about, we're going to extend the first home builder. We're going to increase that, first home buyer, the 5% down scheme, 10,000 more young people can do that. That's great, but that's just 10,000 people that would have bought a house in a year or two if they didn't do that scheme that you've now brought that forward. So what are you going to do next? Are you going to try and encourage 16, 17-year-olds to buy houses? And it's kind of funny we joke about that because in Australia, during the correction we had, we did see articles about encouraging parents buying houses for their children and that. So just if you're not in Australia and you came here and looked at everything and the way it works, you'd be speechless. So when we see these ex-RBA researchers and people like Peter Tulip that Steve Keen spoke about. Former Prime Minister Paul Keating, he's been very, very critical of what they are doing at the moment. And these guys are starting to say the same things, that they no longer act in the public interest. It's these benchmarks and these data points, and then we get to this data point about unemployment that they've been talking about for 10 years, and then they change the goalpost to something else. And now they're saying, well, we've been trying to get inflation to 2 or 3% for 20 years, and we've never really achieved that. But now we're going to say it needs to be higher than that. But there's no exact formula. We're just going to try and get a bit higher than that. It is on. Can you imagine if a heart surgeon was saying that, or any responsible job, an engineer was saying, "Oh, I thought we needed these things on that bridge, but it keeps breaking. Turns out that we actually needed these other things. There's no set policy or science behind what we're doing. It's just a bit of trust us because, well, we're not even elected experts." And it really does my head in. The more that you understand this, and it takes years to greatly, greatly understand this stuff. And I didn't study finance or economics, so I've been reading about it for 12 years now, and I do feel like I've got a good grasp on it. But once you get to this point where your knowledge is at least able to understand what these guys have been taught and how they feel things should be going, and if they act this way, this should happen. And now they're starting to realize that they've kept doing these actions, and this isn't happening. The economy is not getting better, but they're not going to admit they're wrong. And it's not a nice situation when the government themselves are sort of turning to the central bankers and thinking that they're going to help. But the government they're not financial experts or economic experts either. So it honestly is that time where you've got to look out for yourself and learn how to look after yourself. Now, Ian Macfarlane was the former RBA head, and he did a great podcast with Joe, who we've had on the channel, and I'm going to have him back on next week to talk about this podcast in depth, because Ian Macfarlane has just been candidly honest on the Jolly Swagman podcast. Listen to these two if you haven't already. So the first one he did at the start of the year was all about the history of the Australian economy, and he said something really revealing in that show. He spoke about how when they would go out to these meetings, these media conferences or whatever it was, they would often say one thing publicly, even if they actually thought the opposite privately. Or even at some of the meetings of the RBA, they'd nod and shake their heads and all look at each other and agree, and then you'd go home and you'd be thinking, I don't agree with that at all, the decision we came to. And this is where it is just all a little bit of smoke and mirrors, and there's no exact science behind it to pull people up on it anyway. And it's probably a wider philosophical issue about all these guys in these nice suits that get paid, what's Philip Lowe's salary? Hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Do they really want to shake up the system and upset people? The old saying that you'd rather fail doing things the way, the set way, the acceptable way, then go out on a limb and do something different, even if it comes off, the conventional versus unconventional, and you'd rather fail conventionally. So I can't see any other countries. New Zealand's been reasonably honest about negative interest rates. Philip Lowe was probably one of the more honest. As I said, so was the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, when he first got in, but he's just had to change his tune as well. So maybe we're about to see Lowe change his tune completely from all these blogs that he's even done and speeches about how it's not working in Europe and rocking the central bank boat a little bit. So maybe he reins it in. But this podcast from a couple of days ago, round 2 with Ian Macfarlane, He talks about this from start to finish, the rise and fall of monetary policy, and how what we actually see is more to do with things like demographics. We've lived through the greatest boom in modern times, and it hasn't probably been about central banks, printing that money or lowering interest rates. They can tinker at the edges, and maybe when things get to extremes, if you raise interest rates to 17%, that's probably going to change the way people are shuffling their money. But this modern, monthly meetings. Oh, we're going to cut 25 basis points. The RBA are talking about cutting 15 basis points, so 0.15%. And then the bank might pass on half of it. We're talking 7 basis points. Like, who on earth thinks that makes any difference to anyone in the real world? These people are just so book smart and out of touch with reality. And this is what he is almost admitting to, that he's come to the realization that these tools never really worked that well anyway. And we're now at the edge of our limits with rates at zero, and we've already printed trillions of dollars. You can't really, QE3 doing 40 billion a month. It's a big step to go up to 400 billion in some of the packages that we saw in the recent economic shutdown. Now, the next step from that, 4 trillion, and this is kind of the amount of debt or money you need to get the same unit level of growth. And this is why at some point or another, once you get that much money that's out there, and the rich can keep getting richer to some degree, but there will be a point where it's either the wealthy or other countries say, this is getting ridiculous. We need to actually get out of Dodge. We need to start buying up real assets, or we need to do something different with our monetary policy. None of this is making sense. And as soon as that music stops, where are you going to run to? Is real estate, gold. Obviously, I'm a big believer in Bitcoin and crypto as well. But I think more and more as we look at it, there's just a big crack in the entire financial system. And it's all good when all assets are going up, the ETFs, the algorithms that make things more correlated. But I think that is just a symptom of all the money they've printed just going basically into everything. So he's saying here that low rates haven't really done any good. This got covered, this podcast of Joe's got covered in the AFR, so that's pretty awesome. And then in the past 24 hours, different media will tell you that Trump called it off. Others will say that, well, when Trump heard that they weren't getting anywhere, he said to come back in. Biden saying he's turned his back on Americans, so you're going to see all those battles and headlines. But it's really spurning power and roiling markets. So markets tanked on this news, but then the blame game from Pelosi starts as well. But then we saw the Trump tweet storm come out. And so Powell is straight out there doing a little speech here, if you want to check this one out, basically saying that there's just too little support. It'll lead to a weak recovery, and the risks of overdoing it are just so small. So like he's saying with the Fed and inflation, he's saying, don't even worry about inflation. You guys could print $3 trillion and spend it all, and I wouldn't even really be worried about overdoing it. So, just go for it. Spend as much as you want. So then Trump had 2 hours worth of tweets, just all about what he wants to do, what needs to be done, targeting different demographics and voting cohorts. And he managed to basically talk markets up again. So very, very interesting times. Now he's saying he wants to just pass these things ASAP by himself. The dollar is going to get whacked if they do pass these huge multi-trillion-dollar stimuluses or debts, either way you look at it. So that's where the US dollar is, and the question becomes, does Europe have to do more? Does Australia see their Aussie dollar become so strong that we need to start printing stupid amounts of money? So that goes down the path of currency wars. The last thing I want to talk about tying this all together is, for the first time ever, not only have we got gold and silver is also that option to go out of the traditional financial system. But what they did there was control the on-ramps and off-ramps, the ways to invest in gold and silver. They created the futures markets which dominate. And that is basically not real gold or silver. And once you control that, and you have investment vehicles where $1 trillion can go into gold futures, and it doesn't create any more demand for real gold. And so they can control it that way in some degree. Now, yes, we're seeing in other countries real demand start to outpace it, and there's a lot of ETFs that have become popular that are backed by real gold, so that's all good. And I think we're going to see the breaking down of the old system. We already saw that crack when there was a lot of paper, physical, and gold being demanded for delivery at the start of the year. But we've now got these virtual worlds as well as the crypto worlds. So everything from DeFi to DeFo, where we've got these different international currencies. The Forex markets, I think a lot of that money is going to come into the crypto world. So the Forex markets are trillions of dollars a day. Stablecoin growth this year has gone from $1 billion to 20 billion. I think it's going to hit 100 billion next year, then $1 trillion the year after, and then we're basically going to overtake the Forex markets in terms of these currencies that are already digital are just going to become cryptocurrencies because it's just such a better system to use. So that is going to happen. But then we've got this digital world. So I was joking today about this is what I might make our headquarters look like in Decentraland, which is a VR virtual world. But think about all the money that's being spent on these items. So rather than people going out and buying clothes, necklaces, real estate, going to the movies, all that money that would normally circulate in the real economy is money that is going into a digital economy. So the owners of the game or this company normally would make money, but in the world of crypto where everything's decentralized, the owners of the system and the world and the protocol, they all basically benefit. So the thousands or millions of people that end up inhabiting Decentraland or attending games and meetups and whatever it is, maybe we'll have our Christmas party in Nuggets News HQ if we can build this nice looking building, one of you developers out there. But I think that is going to be a big drain out of the system. So think about that US dollar milkshake theory and sucking money out of the US. Well, it's a global problem. There's money being sucked out of all these real world things and into digital worlds. And that's very, very deflationary. At the same time, technology itself is deflationary in other aspects of our lives. As TVs and phones get cheaper, you need less labor. So businesses can scale without having to hire 100 times more people. So there's a lot of things that we're facing, those headwinds of debt, demographics, deflation, and Decentraland now. Well, I guess in general, just decentralization, working from home. People don't have to go to the city. People can live 2 hours away. And so all of a sudden, the prices of real estate level out. There's a lot of things happening which are no longer just a nice, cozy, closed system where most people live in the city. The majority of wealth is in the city and in financial markets. Central banks can just pull that lever, interest rates up or down, print more money, print less money, and things go well. They can steer the economy, and that's what they thought they'd been doing. What we're now facing the reality of is that wasn't really them ever steering the economy in the first place. It was the other macro factors in play that caused things to happen. And now the macro factors in play are against us. So while things have gone up for year after year, the stock market's just grind higher. We can keep making this number on the screen look as rosy as we want, but if the truth is that there's a record amount of retirees that need to sell all the shares in all these indexes where basically everyone's been a buyer for the last 30 years as the baby boomers have grown up. The younger generations don't really want to buy the baby boomers stocks off them. They just want to buy tech stocks, and that's why you see the tech stocks are overvalued. Do the next lot not even interested in buying Facebook and Google? Maybe they do just want to invest in crypto or digital assets, digital artwork that I was joking about the other day in Decentraland. They're going to be investing in all sorts of other things and not being told that they have to put their money in this asset class. So is the Fed going to be the buyer of last resort for everything? And remember, the US dollar is the world reserve currency, and there's all those dollars outside the US. So the Fed have to look after all that as well. So how big is their balance sheet going to be? I honestly think within 5 years, it could be well over $20-30 trillion. That is a lot of money that's going to go into gold and silver, Bitcoin and crypto. So look, that's been about half an hour there, guys. I really, really hope you've enjoyed those thoughts. You're going to love this podcast. Joe and I are going to be talking about it all next week on the channel. So look, I'll leave it there. Please smash that like button. Head over to nuggetsnews.com.au if you want more info or all our free resources on financial markets and crypto markets. Members, I'll talk to you again tomorrow morning. And otherwise, guys, I'll see you again soon. Cheers.